Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. So today we're going to be taking a look at Arcade. We're going to introduce you to it and then take you through some examples of different ways that you can use Arcade across the ArcGIS system. The Q&A today is going to be run using Slido, and the information's on the screen there. We'll also share it again at the end. You can post your questions as we go through as well. And some other bits of housekeeping. So the webinar is being recorded, and we'll share a link in the follow-up email. That email will also include links to useful resources. Hopefully we're going to have inspired you today to go and dig into Arcade and give it a go. So we'll have some useful resources in the follow-up email, so look out for that. As well as running the Q&A in Slido, we'll also and you can submit your questions at any time, so you can do it, pop your questions in as you go through. Remember to look out for things that other people have asked that you're interested in and upvote those. We will try and answer things in popularity order. And we'll also be sharing a poll into Slido as well. And we really appreciate your feedback. It helps us understand our audience and also what you're getting from these sessions. So on to today's webinar. So I'm Alistair Hind, and I'm joined by two colleagues. So Claudia Hodgson and Marina Rupp, and the three of us are going to take you in on a little bit of a tour across the ArcGIS system, looking at how Arcade can be used. So first off, I'll do a quick introduction to Arcade, and then I'll show you some examples in Pro. Claudia's then going to show you some examples in the map viewer, and then Marina's going to round off the session by showing how you can use Arcade to bring your dashboard widgets to a kind of even more spectacular level. So just quickly to run through what Arcade is, the description on the help page calls it a portable lightweight expression language. So what does that mean? The portable bit is the key bit. Arcade exists and was created to provide a single language that can be used to define pieces of workflow across the ArcGIS system. So it will run on a desktop application, it runs in a browser, it can also be used in the mobile apps as well. So it can be supported across those three different technology platforms, and the same Arcade expressions can be used in multiple places across the ArcGIS system. So it gives you a more universal way of adding custom elements into ArcGIS. And that wherever it's running on the client side. So it's kind of run at in the moment on the client. The lightweight, it has a low footprint, and that helps with deploying it out through our mobile apps. And then the final phrase there, expression, because it runs small pieces of script within the context of another application, it's called an expression language, but it's not a difference to worry about. A lot of people just talk about Arcade scripts. So you know, whether you choose to call it a scripting language or an expression language, it doesn't really matter. Where can you use it? So you can use it in a lot of different places across ArcGIS. So you can use it in the field calculators in both Pro and Portal. You can use it in labeling, symbology, charts, and pop-ups, and we'll try and give you a flavor of those today. Those different places that it can be run are referred to as the profiles. So in the documentation, you'll see it talking about profiles, and these are the environment in which your Arcade expression is going to be evaluated and interpreted, so where it's going to run. So it provides that context. It also then defines the variables that are available to you as profile variables. So these are the ones preceded with $, and we'll show you some examples of those. But it's things like the feature that is currently being acted on by something like the labeling engine. The profile also determines the function bundles. So you do get slight differences in which parts of the Arcade function set are available in different places. So that's just something to be aware of, and also the types of data types that can be returned from an expression. All of that's covered in the documentation, so it lists all the different profiles. You'll see some of them there, and we'll be touching on some today. And it's just something to be aware of. There are then some subtle differences about what you can use where. But the documentation explains all of that. It's a really well structured set of documentation. There's some really nice introductory sections, and then it also takes you step by step through the different elements of the language, how it's structured and what you can use. And as you can see on the screen there, lots of code snippets. You can even choose to show them in the dark mode. The other bit that's important to kind of dig into is the function reference, and that gives you the full set of all the different functions there are. You'll see some examples of those today, but we've only got a chance to show you a few. There's a lot in there. The other thing just to quickly touch on is the version of Arcade that's running will depend on which part of ArcGIS you're using and what version that part of the kind of system is at. So just as an example, if you're using an older version of Pro, you will be on a slightly older version of Arcade. But that's something that you can double check in the version matrix in the documentation as well. So that's it from the quick introduction. It's time to jump over into Pro and take a look at some of those things in action. So the data set that we're going to focus on today is the habitat networks data set from Natural England. This is in the Living Atlas, and in my Pro project here, in my map, I'm pulling it from the Living Atlas so that I don't have a local copy of this data. I'm pulling it across from the Living Atlas. So the data has a fairly simple set of fields. One of the key ones there is the class. So that's the class of the habitat network, and that defines what type of habitat it refers to. So I'm just going to pop that down there for now. And we're going to start off by having a look at the labeling. So at the moment, my labeling is set to, excuse me a second. So if I switch on my labeling, I've got it set up so it's labeling the labeling it based on those class values. And what I want to do is change these slightly. Now, I don't have a local copy of this, so I can't set up a field and kind of do a field calculation and swap them that way. But I can use Arcade within the labeling engine to customize my labeling. So first thing I want to do is change the PHI others, and I want to simplify that slightly. So on the right here, because I've chosen to use a custom expression, it's already set me up with a basic Arcade expression that reflects the default setting, the setting that I might have at the moment, which is just to show the class attribute value of the feature. And you'll see the dollar feature there is the profile variable that I mentioned before. So I can access for the feature that's being evaluated, I can then access one of its attributes using the dot notation. So what I'm going to do is say if my feature class value is equal to PHI underscore other. With the quotes, you can use single or double quotes, but it's worth being a little bit consistent. And then if it's that, we're going to simplify our label to other. So before running your Arcade, you can double check whether or not it's correct. And I've actually missed off one of my brackets. It tells me what line the error's on, gives me a little bit of information about what I've missed. So let's pop the bracket back in. So now when I apply that, we'll see some changes to the labeling. And I've successfully relabeled some of them, but I've also lost most of my labels. And that's because all I've done at the moment is said, if my condition is met, then here's the string to use for the label. And what I've forgotten to do is put in an else statement. And in that, I just want to return the class, so I can do that by double clicking and it will fill in the feature class bit of syntax for me. When I apply that, my other labels come back, but I've still got my customized label. So if I want to carry on with this and maybe shorten some of these and abbreviate them, I could, in my script, start doing else if, which I've mistyped. You'll see it's actually stayed in black to indicate that it's not recognized it as a correct term. but I'm actually going to use a slightly different structure. So let me paste in my bit of arcade here. So what I'm doing at the top here is using a thing called a dictionary. So this lets me define a combination of key values, which are these left-hand ones, and then a set of values that are associated with those keys. In this case, the value is also a string. So if I can, in my if statement now, I can do if my dictionary, which is called relabel, has a key with a value that matches the class of the feature, then I want to retrieve the value from the dictionary and then return that. Otherwise, just use the standard one. So again, double check that it's correct. So now when I run that, you'll see that it's relabeled, abbreviated some of my labeling, but there's some of them that haven't worked. And again, in here, I've got a slight mistake. I've actually done a copy and paste error. I've mistermed the network enhancement zone 1 class as expansion zone. So it's just always important to remember to double check when you're putting together a bit of arcade. Just double check that it's actually doing what you want it to do, because like any code, it will do what you have told it to do, and that's not always quite what you intended. So just double check things before you go ahead and kind of use them in earnest. So that's a couple of examples of how to use it in labeling. I'm now going to jump down to my charts down the bottom here. So let's drag this up a little bit. And I've got a chart of the areas of the different habitat zones. And it's using meters squared, which is the value for the geometry. So it's the default value for my area. But I actually want that in hectares. So again, because I'm streaming the data, I want to be able to calculate that dynamically. And I've been able to do that using a simple bit of arcade. So in here, rather than selecting a field, I've chosen to set an expression. And I can then, if I just open this up, this is a really simple, just a very simple calculation. I'm taking the feature shape area and dividing it by 10,000. I had to go away and look up how to turn meters squared into hectares because it's not something I do very often. But so you can run some simple calculations on the fly, and it will then reflect that in your chart. So you'll see this is now pulled the kind of sum of hectares is pulled down from what it was in meters squared. So that's a really simple example of using it in charts, but you could go a little bit more complex than that. You could include some other elements that you'll see in the different places that we're showing you back into your charts. So before moving out of Pro, the last thing I want to do is to take a look at using it in the field calculator and running some slightly more complex arcade. So I've got this second feature class in here, which are the local planning areas for around Birmingham. So for these, I've actually exported the ones from my area of interest from the Living Atlas. So I do have a local copy of these. And that local copy, I've then added a couple of fields that I want to populate, and I'm going to show you the calculation that I'm using for one of them. So this field, I want it to hold the sum of all of the network enhancement zones that there are within that planning area, but I only want the area that overlaps with my local planning area. So there's a little bit more to kind of do in there. So I'm going to open up my field calculator. And just while that's opening, I've got a text file here where I'm keeping my bits of arcade. I find it really useful to keep a copy somewhere else. So in this case, just in a text file. And it's really handy when you're kind of developing your arcade and you can keep a copy of it and then modify it. And if you decide that actually the new version's working better, kind of save off that. But I also find it useful to keep my own personal library of samples. You know, I can remember times when I've run a bit of arcade before and I think actually I want to do something a bit like that in this project. I can go back and find my own sample, so I'm not always starting from scratch. So if I paste that into the calculator here, and I'm just going to quickly run you through how this is working and point out a couple of key features. So I'm getting the geometry of my feature, and I'm holding that in a variable. So I've defined a local variable in this expression called this geometry, and that means that I've grabbed a copy of the geometry up front and I'm holding it in memory because I'm going to use that more than once in my expression. I've also got a variable for holding that cumulative area, and I've set it to -1 because then if something fails in the script, if it doesn't do what I expect it to do, I'll be able to see that reflected in the value that's returned. Next, I need to get hold of my habitat network areas. This particular bit of ArcGIS is running in the field calculator for the local planning areas. So I don't have direct access to my habitat network. So I'm actually retrieving them using feature set by portal item back from ArcGIS using the unique ID for the item, the layer. So there's only one layer in here. So it's the first one, so 0. I'm asking it to only pull through some of the attributes, only the attribute that I want to use, which is class. And then this final bit says is about whether or not you want the geometry. So I do want the geometry of these features because I'm going to use those in the thing. The less information that you ask for in your script, the faster the script runs the expression. So that gives me all of my habitat network areas. There's over 160,000 of them. So it's a large feature set. So the next thing I want to do is start filtering that down, and an attribute based filter is going to be faster than a geometry calculation. So I do my attribute filter first. So that's just the network enhancement zones. So that runs here. So it just runs it as a little bit of SQL. And then having got my enhancement zones, yeah, that bit succeeded. I've managed to kind of successfully retrieve enhancement zones. I set my area to 0, and then I find the enhancement zones that intersect the current polygon that I'm doing the calculation for. So that's using that variable for the geometry. And then for those habitats, I've now refined it right down. I'm going to iterate through those using a thing called a for loop. So this says for each habitat in my refined collection of features, so the habitat network features, now find the intersection between the habitat and my my planning area geometry, and that I'm then going to add to my cumulative area. So plus equals means add it to the existing value. And rather than dividing by 10,000 to get hectares, I've actually used one of the functions. So there's a function called area, and that allows me to just drop in the geometry and say what units I want it in. And when all of that's run, it will then return the area for the feature. So if I hit apply, you'll see it takes a little while to run. And that's because of the kind of scale of calculation. It's doing geometry manipulations. It's working with a large data set of over 160,000 features. And it's having to do that for each of my local planning areas. And it's because of that overhead that some of the functions in ArcGIS, like the geometry functions, aren't available in a profile like labeling, because the overhead on the labeling engine would just make the labeling process too unresponsive. So it's worth being a little bit aware, particularly if you're working with large data sets, that it can, although you are able to do things on the fly using ArcGIS, it can become a little bit slow. So that's it for our quick tour of ArcGIS Pro. I'm now going to hand straight over to Claudia, who's going to take a look at using ArcGIS within the map viewer.
Thank you, Alistair. Good morning, everyone. So yeah, as Alistair mentioned, we're now going to be taking a look at how we can apply ArcGIS to the map viewer. And we're going to be focusing on mostly elevating our pop-ups, but we'll also take a little look at our data symbology as well. But before we do all of that, firstly, I wanted to show you the Arcade editor in ArcGIS Online and Enterprise. As you can probably see already, it's quite different to what we've just seen in ArcGIS Pro. So I think this editor, personally, I find it a really approachable layout. It's a really great place to get started with your arcade and kind of getting through and mastering your arcade as well, because it has such a supportive interface. We've got obviously the main kind of code window here, of course, and then over on the right-hand side, we've got those things like the profile variables that Alistair mentioned. We've got the functions as well, and then again in each of these, we've got all of the information you need for applying that function, along with some sample code as well. There's also some additional tabs, supportive tabs. We've got kind of suggestions, or this actually last one with the question mark links out directly to the arcade documentation. And the kind of supportive element that I'm talking about here carries on to when you're writing your code as well. For example, here we've got a really nice, simple kind of line of arcade, very similar to something that Alistair has shown. Now, let's just say when I was writing this, I've accidentally added an additional parentheses. You can see straight away I've got that kind of squiggly line underneath here, as well as a red mark over on the right-hand side. So this means as I'm obviously adding more and more lines of code, maybe more than just the one line I've got here, it's really easy to then navigate to the mistakes in your code, identify the errors, and get to the bottom of it nice and easily, which, especially for me, who's someone who's quite new to code, it just feels an incredibly supportive interface. Now, I've actually written this expression as part of the pop-up that I've created for this demo today, because I think we all know the default kind of pop-up that you can get in Map Viewer, and it looks a little bit like this one we've got here, which ultimately is doing its job. I mean, we're finding out more information about this data set, but I think there's definitely more that we can do to make this more engaging, to maybe better convey some of the information, and really just to make it a bit more exciting. So with a few lines of arcade and maybe a little bit of HTML in there as well, you can transform your pop-ups into something that's just completely different. I think this is kind of something far more engaging and far more informative as well. So we're going to have a little look at how we can apply these kind of things to our pop-ups. And we're going to start at the top here with this very first kind of element or paragraph you can see here. So this first element, really straightforward, is simply stating the habitat class that we've selected. So in this case, Network Enhancement Zone 1. And then it's also not only telling us the area of that habitat, but it's actually assigned it a category. So in this case, category 6. So you might have guessed it that this is done using Arcade. So let's go into the expression and take a little look. So here you can see it's obviously a few more lines of code than the one I've just shown, but it's actually really straightforward when you look a little bit closer. So firstly, lines 3 through to 8 here, we're defining the categories that I want to create in this expression. So I've kept my naming pretty straightforward here, and I've just categorized them from 1 through to 6. But obviously, if this is a real life scenario, you might have kind of more complex categories, but I've kept it really simple for the purpose of this demo. And then next up, lines 12 through to 22, we're then defining the size range for the area of that habitat into each of these categories that we've defined above from categories 1 through to 6. So for example, taking a look at this first one, we're using an if statement here. So if the selected feature, which is our profile variable here, if the selected the shape area of that feature is less than or equal to 80,000, it's going to return category 1. Now, if that statement isn't met, Arcade's going to move on to the next one. And if it's not met again, it's going to carry on looping through until the feature is then defined one of these categories below. So that's our expression. In terms of adding it into your pop-up, it's actually really straightforward as well. So if I just come out of the editor and I move over to our text element, it's simply a case of adding in our expressions here, just like we would our field lists. So you can see I've got my habitat category zone size here, and it's got the label expression too. So as soon as I click that, it then adds it into my text element here. So it's really nice and straightforward. Now, just quickly staying on this element that we've got here, you might notice that the class that we've got written here is in a different color font, and that's to reflect the color of our habitat class, how it's symbolized in the map. So it's a really nice way to kind of have them talking to each other and just clearly seeing what habitat you've selected. Again, this is a really nice simple arcade expression. If I just pop back into it, it's using a dictionary, just like Alistair did in ArcGIS Pro. So I'm not going to go into it much, but in this case, we're simply defining for each of our habitat classes in our layer, we're defining the relevant hex code that we want to symbolize it in. And then actually what I did want to show was applying this to your pop-up is different to what I've shown previously, because this time we are jumping into the HTML only a little bit. So if I go back into my text element, this time you want to open up the source. And you'll see here, this is the HTML that we're looking at, and it's a simple case of just locating the element where you want to apply this expression. And here I've got the habitat class where this feature is. And when it's specifying the color, I just return the expression that's got that dictionary within it. So it's a really nice way to apply that code and play around a little bit with the HTML, but I think it's a nice touch for the pop-up. So we're now going to move on to this sentence beneath our table that we've got here. And this is a statistic telling us exactly how many land use areas are intersecting our habitat network zones. So now this is using Arcade to bring in features from another layer on our map. It's using this one at the top here that I've got on my layer list. Now this is the layer called the Maps Plus OS Land Use. And if I just jump into our Arcade expression, I'll show you how we've gone about doing that. So as I said, we're actually pulling in another layer from our map, and we're seeing how both of those layers interact with one another. And we're doing that using the function feature set by name. And this is where I can simply reference that other layer. So you can see we've got that the title of the layer here. And just like Alistair did as well, I'm also referencing that I'm only interested in bringing across one field, which in this case is OS Land Use Tier A. This dataset that I'm using, I should add, is a Maps Plus dataset, which is one of our data as a service offerings. And I'm using their layer that's available in the beta service, which is looking at land use areas across Great Britain provided by Ordnance Survey. So that's our first line, is bringing in that dataset into so that we can interact with our habitat feature layer. I'm then creating another variable, which is returning the geometry of our selected habitat. And then we're defining another variable again. This time it's just bringing those two together with an intersect function. So I can see where the land use polygons from my Maps Plus dataset is intersecting with the geometry of our habitats that we're looking at. And then lastly, we're simply returning a count to then count the number of times that intersection is occurring. So not only with Arcade can we use it for calculating statistics or defining categories, etc., we can easily bring in multiple layers from our map into one expression and evaluate how they interact with one another, count statistics from multiple fields, which is really, really powerful, I think. So I'm not going to have time to be able to go through each of these pop-up elements and how they were looked at with Arcade, but I did take a great deal of inspiration for the remainder of these elements from one of our blogs, which is looking about how you can get creative with pop-ups, and we've linked that in the follow-up email, so be sure to have a look out for that to see how you could create a pop-up just like this. The very last thing that I did want to show you is how you can apply Arcade to your data's symbology. Because you can simply, could be as easy as setting an expression for the attributes that you want to show with your data, which you can do here by creating an expression. But in this case, I'm symbolizing by habitat class, and really that does make sense for my data, so I'm not going to go ahead and change that. One thing I'm not too happy with though is that where the dataset has an abundance of habitats, it's really obstructing my underlying base map all around here. So instead, I'm going to head into the style options of my data. I'm going to scroll right on down to the bottom, and you can see you can actually specify an expression for defining the transparency of your data. So here I'm going to use Arcade to apply a greater transparency to habitats with a larger area, whilst also making sure I'm not losing dominance on the smaller habitats as well. So this is, again, a really simple Arcade expression. If I just comment back out this expression, we're using a really simple logical function called when, which is essentially evaluating a series of expressions that we've written until one returns true. So basically, we're doing the exact same thing like we did with the category size. And if it's within this size range, it's going to return 4, vice versa, all the way down to number 1. When I then click apply, you're going to see those categories 1 through 4 appear on this transparency bar that we've got here. And I can play around with these values so that it kind of suits my symbology. And you can see there we've still got the small habitats clearly represented across our map, but we've got those larger habitats kind of added some transparency to, so they're not dominating our map and we can still see that underlying base map. So hopefully that was useful, and hopefully you've seen kind of the what's possible within Map Viewer. But I'm now going to hand it over to Marina, who's going to show us a little bit of Arcade in dashboards.
Thank you, Claudia. So I'm going to talk about dashboards and how you can use Arcade there. Within dashboards, you can use Arcade in 2 ways. So either you can use it to format your widgets like your pie charts, list widgets, and tables. And alternatively, you can use it as a data source for one of the data-driven elements in your dashboard. So let's have a look at one of the examples I've prepared in advance. So you can see a dashboard here, which is very basic and it doesn't use any Arcade so far. And in today's webinar, I'd like to focus on 3 areas. We're going to have a look at the pie chart, the table widget, and the list widget. And I'd like to start with the pie chart. So at the moment, you can see it's very cluttered and it's like presenting loads of information. What I'd like to do for the purpose of the dashboard I'm creating, I would rather have the pie chart to just show me the top 5 classes based on the count of each feature. And to do this, I'm going to use a data expression as the data source for my chart. And this is how it basically looks once I've kind of like put in my data expression. So let's have a look at the code. So usually you would kind of like select a layer that you're interested in to use in your widget, and I've used a data expression instead. This is very similar to what Alistair has shown you earlier on as well, and Claudia as well, so I'm not going to go into too much detail with this, but basically I'm specifying the portal I'm using, and then I'm using the unique ID from the feature layer to say this is the layer I want to reference in this code. What I've done next is I basically grouped my values. So I'm using the group by expression, and I'm saying basically here to use the class column of my feature layer. And then I'm creating an extra column, which is going to be called feature count. And in this column, please return me the count of the features. And then the next bit I'm going to do is, because I want to get like the top 5, I need to order my kind of like grouped values now, and then I need to return the top 5 of this. So as you can see, I've just used a single line of code here, and this is called a chain. You can also like write this code in like separate lines if this is easier for you, but you can also merge them together. If you merge them together, you will basically work from the inside to the outside. So the first bit this code is doing is first processing the order by expression. So here I'm telling with Arcade, I'm basically saying, please use my grouped classes and sort the table based on the feature count column in a descending order. So that's the first part that's doing. And then it's moving out to the second part of the expression, which is the top expression, which is now taking my grouped and ordered classes and will just return the top 5. And I'm quickly going to run this so you kind of like have a visual explanation for this. So you can see we have like the classes here, and then we have the feature count column that we've created, and that's in a descending order, and it just returns the top 5, which is what I want to display. Some of you might have noticed that I'm using like these kind of like backslashes in my code, and they are here to comment out sections of code or alternatively to add information to my code. And the latter part is very important for 2 main reasons in my point of view. So if you were to go and share your code with your colleagues, it's really important that you add comments. So if the other person opens your code and uses it, they get an idea of what you're trying to do and they're not completely lost with just code. The second reason is you might want to reuse your code at some point in the future, say like in a year's time. And if you go back to your code, very often what you find is that you can't remember quite what you were doing. But if you add in comments, it helps you to remember the steps you've been taking and like maybe like mention like pitfalls and everything. So I really recommend to comment out your code and like add additional information when you do that. The next widget we're looking at is the table widget. So you can see it's a basic table. It serves its purpose. It shows me all the columns I have selected. But I think we can tidy it up a bit more and make it like more in like giving me more information out of it. So what I'm planning to do is 3 things. The first thing I'm doing, in the area name column, you can see we have LPA in each of the lines, and I'd like to remove this because it's not adding any information to my table. The second bit I'm doing is I'm adding an icon to my count columns, and this is going to be either or. So it's going to be an icon pointing upwards or downwards, and it's going to have different colors depending on a threshold. So I want it to be pointing downwards if it's below 100, and I want an icon that points upwards if it's above 300. And the final thing I'd like to change is I'd like to highlight rows in my table if the area in hectares is below 1,000 hectares. This is how the final result would be looking like. So you can see the LPA has disappeared, and we have 2 different icons depending on a set threshold value, and we have some highlighted columns. So let's have a look on how this code is working. So the first part I'm doing to replace the LPA from the name is I'm using the replace function. Here you just have to specify the column that you're interested in, and then you tell it what it should watch out for and what it should remove. So in my case, I'd like to remove the LPA with an empty space. And by default, this will replace all the things it finds that match the LPA. And that's it. That's all you have to do for replacing the field in a name. The next part, as I said, I'd like to use the icon. So for those of you that have used dashboards previously, you know that you can define an icon and give it a name. I've already done this. The code bits that you can see here are already pre-formatted basically. So when you enable advanced formatting, this will appear here. So it's just telling you each of the columns. So you can see my 3 columns are here. And now you just have to identify the column that you would like to add your icon in. And in my case, I'm going to use my count column, and I'm adjusting the icon name and the icon color fields. Claudia has shown you earlier on that she was using a when function, and I'm using the same for my case here. So I'm not going to go into too much detail with that. But basically what it's doing, it's looking through all of the elements in my table, and when it's returning true, it will do something based on a condition I've set. I have 2 conditions in there. So the first one is if my count is below 100, I'd like it to return the count smaller 100 icon. This is just the icon name I've used and defined in advance. And if the count is above 300, I use the icon that I named count above 300. And if none of the 2 is the case, I leave it empty. And then I'm basically using the exact same data expression to change the color of the icon. So the only thing I have to do here is to replace the icon name with the color I'd like to use, which is going to be dark red and dark green. Also note that alternatively, you can use hex codes here if you want to. So that's 2 of the 3 things done already that I tried to adjust. The final thing that we have to do now is highlighting the rows that have hectares less than 1,000. So I have to admit, I slightly changed here my default code. So usually it would just return a table, but I'm actually putting this into a variable because I'm using this now in my part of code below. The first thing I've created a threshold variable where I say that if the hectares field is below 1,000, please put it into this below threshold variable. Then I'm using a for loop, and again, Alistair has shown this in advance, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But basically what this is doing, within my for loop, I'm having an if function. And if the area is less than 1,000, if that's true, it will kind of like label my text color, it will change my text color, and it will also change the background color to my predefined values. And the last bit I then have to do is to return my entire table. The last thing I'd like to show you is the list widget. As you can see at the moment, the list widget doesn't really group your values. So we can see the multiple times of my class. And you can also see that it has a gray box in the front. And I'd like to group my values again first, and then change the symbol in the front. So if you don't want to use Arcade, you could use a table widget instead to group your values. But if you'd like to kind of like keep the functionality of the list widget, you can again use a data expression. So this is the final result that I'm gonna go for. And let's have a look at the code, how this is done. So as I said, I'm grouping my classes again, and this is again with a data expression, and it's basically the exact same data expression we've used for the pie chart, just that I end with the grouping of it. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that part. So how am I adding the icons? This is a bit more of an interesting part because we're basically using Arcade in combination with HTML. So the first part I did, I'm creating a variable for my symbol colors. And similar to Claudia, I've basically put down all of my classes and gave them a specific color. Then I'm just defining a symbol size, which I'm just going to hold into a variable because I'm going to use it in the next part of code. So the section you can see here is basically HTML. So I'm building a string that is HTML, and that's shown with the backtick symbol. And it's making use of HTML functionality. So I'm using the SVG from HTML, and I'm defining its height and its width based on the variable I've created above. And then I'm using basically saying it to be a rectangle, and I'm defining the size of the rectangle. So I'm giving it a height, a width, the Rx and Ry make my rectangle having round corners. I position it, and then I use the fill and refer that back to the colors I've defined at the top of my code. So when I'm returning this code, I will have to return it as an attribute, at least the HTML part, because this is going to be referenced in the line item templates. So if I scroll down here, you can see the line item template, and it already tells you this in the information. So it references attributes from an Arcade expression, and it tells you how to do this. And this is basically the first part you can see here. We're using expression, a slash, and then we specify the attribute that we created within Arcade. And this is how I returned those colorful squares in front of my text. And that's everything I wanted to show you today. So you can see with a few lines of Arcade, you can transform your dashboard quite a lot. And there are a lot of resources out there to help you with Arcade in dashboards and to get you inspired. We also have linked one of those blogs in a follow-up email that you will receive after the webinar. And with that, I'm handing back over to Alistair.
Thank you, Marina. So let me just reshare the slides. So we're kind of conscious that we've taken up a fair chunk of the time. We are going to run over a little bit into the remainder of the hour to run the Q&A. So if you're able to stay with us, that's great. Just before we switch over to the Q&A, look out for our next webinar in the series, which will actually be the winter ArcGIS update, and that's on the 14th of December. And for any of you that are able to get to Cardiff next week on Wednesday, it's our Welsh conference, so you can actually kind of get an in-person experience and find out more about ArcGIS and what some of the customers are doing with it there. With that, we're going to switch over to the Q&A. We're actually joined by one of our resident Arcade superheroes, Carmel Connolly, who's going to help us out with the webinar as well. So let's fire on with that.
So that very first question that we've got here, will Esri UK run as an instructor-led training course for Arcade? So at the moment, we haven't got any specific instructor-led ones, but if you take a look at the follow-up email that we'll be sending out after this webinar, we've referenced to that you can learn along at your own pace, as well as all of these different blogs that we've been mentioning and the documentation. So I'd really take a look at all of those. That's how personally kind of I've got to know it, and I think there's some really great resources out there for us to use. So that's that one.
And following on from that, the next one there is around using Arcade in the field calculator. There's a couple of questions about that in the window here. So if you're already familiar with Python, there's no particular reason to switch to using Arcade in the field calculator. There will be some differences potentially in what you can do with it, but if you're able to do the things that you need to do with Python, there's not a particular reason to switch, and you do have that choice of Python Arcade, but also within Pro. Python's available in Pro. If you're trying to use the field calculator in Portal, you will need to use Arcade there. The Pro field calculator also supports VB script, and I think something else as well. So again, one of the questions was somebody looking to migrate from ArcMap to ArcGIS Pro, and you're still able to use the same set of languages within the field calculator, but Arcade's there as an option. If you haven't used any of them before, Arcade's a good one to get familiar with, because you've then got that crossover into the other places that you can use it. And then another question there is around labeling features on related records. So you can access features that are through related records in Arcade, but it's I had a quick look. I'd double check, but I think it might be one of the things that you're not able to do within the labeling just because of that performance overhead. But it's something that if you go into the documentation, you'll be able to find it in there and double check. But just from a quick look, I think it's one of the areas that you can't do within labeling just because of the extra work that you're then putting onto the client, and it would slow your map down.
Yeah, exactly, Alistair. But it is available by pop-up, so you can still expose that information just in a different way.
And then somebody's asked whether Arcade is Esri specific and whether it's based on another language. So Arcade is Esri specific, and it's that desire to have a single expression language that can be used across the different environments that led Esri to creating Arcade. It is based on and follows some of the kind of syntax elements of other languages. So particularly, I think if you've done JavaScript before, you'll find it very familiar. And some of the it uses some of the kind of common conventions of other languages as well. So things like the double backslash for comments and the curly brackets to define the scope of things like if and for blocks as well.
We've also had a question come in asking whether the web map and dashboard showed, whether we can share that. So we won't be sharing the actual web map and dashboard, but what I do recommend is, as we said, this webinar is being recorded. So I'd really recommend just keep going back through that and take a look at our code. Especially for my section, I took a great deal of inspiration from that blog that I mentioned, and that's actually got a sample map within it. So you can actually go into the map itself, go into the pop-ups, take a look at the arcade, the expressions. So that's a really, really good place to start. So as I said, that will all be in the follow-up email for you guys to take a look at.
So carrying on with some of the other questions, one of them is around whether Arcade uses credits, and again, I'd want to double check, but my understanding is that Arcade doesn't consume credits because it's not creating persistent changes, and it's not making use of the same analysis services that I used for that then do have that kind of credit burden with them. So I'm fairly sure they don't consume credits. And then the other one that somebody's asked was around there's a question about some of the features that we've shown today being something that you need to add by using Arcade. So I think this is particularly in reference to Marina's examples in the dashboard and why they're not in the core software. Some of those things may get picked up, if it's something that kind of proves popular, and you can submit ideas on our Esri community sites to try and to sort of put forward ideas for enhancing the core software. In some cases, it's more about people having used the flexibility of Arcade creatively and come up with a different way of doing it, and then that then becomes an example that people are piggybacking on. So that's where people are kind of almost sort of stretching beyond the what's in the core software by making use of Arcade. So one of the questions is around Arcade and Experience Builder. So at the moment, Arcade isn't supported within Experience Builder. I don't have any information on kind of where it sits on the roadmap, but it is something that the development team are looking at.
Alistair, on that, do you mean to actually create Arcade within Experience Builder itself? Are you able to consume Arcade created in pop-ups and labels within Experience Builder?
Yes, that's a good point, Carmel. If it's used within the map, so if you've set up Arcade in the labeling in the map or in the pop-up, that will work in that will carry through into Experience Builder. What's not available at the moment is the ability to run Arcade within the widgets in Experience Builder in the way that you can in dashboards. There's a question about backwards compatibility with Arcade. So when I mentioned the versions, those versions are, I guess, cumulative. So when they release a new version of Arcade, so if you're moving from an older version of Pro forwards, it extends the language. So there haven't been any changes that are not backwards compatibility as far as I know. There's also a question there about calculating distance to other features. So the geometry functions for Arcade are quite extensive, and it does include distance. It includes, and there's a version that's the geodetic distance as well. So there's lots of different geometry operations you can do. So that should cover you for the question there about calculating the distance to other features. I don't know whether or not there's a hard copy book on Arcade. I haven't had a look on the kind of Esri Press library. What I would say is certainly my own kind of experience is that the online documentation is pretty good. I know sometimes it's nice to kind of have a hard copy next to you, but it's very well laid out in the kind of online version. And the other advantage there, of course, is that you can then pick up those samples and use them as a starting place. That one. Yeah, Carmel, I don't know if there's any of the remaining ones that you've got an answer to just while I'm having a kind of skim through.
Absolutely. Yeah, so
on
is it better to configure pop-ups to Arcade and ArcGIS Pro before publishing or in the browser? It's completely up to you. If you do it in Pro, you're doing it once and then it's available through your web maps, field maps, etc. But you have that flexibility to then also do it in the browser. It's definitely up to just personal choice. If you want to keep that source within Pro or do it through the browser itself, it's definitely kind of your subjective choice. And the profiles, I believe most cases are the same, but check out that profile page within the Arcade developer help. It's really clear in whether a profile is available in Pro, Field Maps, Quick Capture, ArcGIS Online or not. So that will help you distinguish whether profiles are the same or not.
So we've had a few come in. I'm just going to kind of jump around a couple of these questions. We've got one that's come in about instructor-led courses again, saying terrible at spelling, I'd like to attend a course. Is there a MOOC? So we do have, again, if you check out this follow-up email, we have it's a course with a series of different kind of lessons for you to follow through. I definitely check out those. There's also a self-paced, like a learning plan as well, that just gets you hands-on, and it starts with the basics. I am definitely not a coder, and I've kind of gone through all of those, and it's helped me to feel more comfortable with it. And you kind of just getting hands-on with it helps to build that experience. So I myself am definitely a beginner. So I definitely say that those kind of places are a good place to start. So keep an eye out for that follow-up email where we'll attach everything in there.
I agree with that one, Claudia. I'd also recommend thinking about a use case that you have personally to try and help learning Arcade, rather than just following examples that might not necessarily be applicable to your work. If you have something that you want to do, that's definitely a good way to build up your skills.
And so one of the questions somebody's asked about is around the dictionary. So I think in 2 or 3 of the examples we made use of the dictionary object. If you go back in and watch the recording, you should be able to see the structure of it. But again, I'd just go over and have a look at it in the help file. So in the documentation, there's a whole section where it talks about the different data types that you can use within Arcade, and in there it will explain about what a dictionary is and how that works, and also an array, which is a kind of an alternative way of creating a collection of objects that you can then manipulate in your Arcade expression.
If it helps with dictionaries, every time I go to make a dictionary, I have to look up the help every time. So the help is really useful just to get those examples from and then build upon them.
We've had another one come in as well, asking whether we can have a future webinar on a couple of things. This is really useful. It's incredible to hear from you guys what webinars you do want to see. We have just activated some polls, and there's a particular one in there for any comments or anything like that. If you have any suggestions that you want to see resources-wise or webinars-wise, let us know, because we really do kind of factor all of those things in, and we want to know what you guys want to hear about. So please do keep those messages coming.
Yeah, it's a good point, Claudia. And then somebody's asked about finding the expressions that you've used across various dashboards without having to look into each one. Unfortunately, there isn't actually an easy way of just getting it to list all the Arcade that you're using in something like a dashboard. And again, that for me, that goes back to that idea of maybe having an offline copy of it. So as well as having it incorporated in different places of your dashboard, if you're responsible for maintaining that dashboard, you might find it useful to have a document where you've got those pieces of Arcade kind of laid out, so you can see all the different places that you've used them in case you do need to make any updates. And then you've also then got them as handy samples for your next dashboard. So we're pretty close to time now, so I think we'll wrap it up there. We appreciate we haven't managed to cover all of your questions, and we really appreciate the level of engagement that we've had. So just the kind of final thing is that hopefully that kind of level of engagement shows that you've either started using Arcade or you're sort of looking to get interested. And we definitely recommend just giving it a go. Make use of those resources that we've talked about and we'll share afterwards, and have a go. It can even just some of those really simple things that we started with can make a big difference to how things like your maps look, through to the kind of more complex bits of customization that Marina finished with in dashboards. So thank you all for joining us and for staying with us for the Q&A. Really appreciate that, and hopefully you'll be back in December for our next webinar. Thank you.